to welcome back to the program Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and author of his latest, The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, Corey Robin. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back. Really happy to be here.
I think we had you on. We definitely had you on. Last time was for The Reactionary Mind, which is also a book I would highly recommend to folks. And I learned a lot from that book, actually. It sadly comes in handy with about half the things that the people that we talk about on this program, the right-wing hipsters. But aside from that, let's move into this. Well, let's just start with, because this book is less of a critique of an ideology and more of an examination of a specific, I guess, ideology that you could say of Clarence Thomas. Why Clarence Thomas?
Well, first of all, he is increasingly one of the most powerful members of the Supreme Court. In the last couple of years with the appointment of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, there's been a solidified right-wing bloc on the court. And Thomas is the longest-serving justice on the current Supreme Court, which gives him seniority in certain kinds of cases. So he's a powerful figure that people are beginning to recognize and reckon with. And second of all, he's probably, despite being a very well-known figure, he's probably the least well-known and most misunderstood figure on the court. People know startlingly little about him and what he thinks. And so just right there, I mean, the combination of this very powerful man in American government about whom we know very little, I think, argues for the need for such a book. And then, the last thing I would say is when you bring in the fact that he's African-American, he's arguably the most powerful African-American person in the United States. And we live at a moment where I think particularly people on the left are very concerned and interested in what it is that black people have to say. And here is this extraordinarily influential voice who's African-American. And again, I think it behooves us to at least listen to what he has to say, not because he's right or anything like that, but because of the power and influence he has.
And, which I did not realize, because he's 9 years away from being the longest serving Supreme Court justice in the history of the country.
Yes, I know. When I did those numbers, it sort of, I had the same kind of reaction. He was appointed very young, and he's only 71 now. And, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Stephen Breyer are both well into their 80s. Thomas, Anthony Kennedy was, I think, 81 when he retired. So Thomas doesn't have that long to hold on before he really will become the longest-serving justice in American history. And
we should say too that on paper at least, or I'm trying to narrowly slice this. In some ways, he's the model of what we're going to get, and maybe this is something that we should talk about at the end of our talk here today. But when we look at all of the appointees over the past two Republican administrations, and this one, this is the model, right? We're not used to getting, or I don't know how to articulate this, but it's atypical to have justices appointed in their 40s. Right. And have them be on the court for 40 some odd years. Yeah. No, this has been, in some ways, this has been the plan of the right for some time. And he's the archetype. He's the prototype. And the fact that he's, only coming into his own now when he still has, a good number of years arguably left in his life, that is something that we should be getting used to. And if nothing else, the five of them, the five very hard right justices on the Supreme Court, that is a permanent lock that no matter what happens in the electoral realm, we will be grappling with for quite some time. And lastly, just so that we get sort of these more material basic things out of the way, I mean, I know Clarence Thomas just from basically, I mean, obviously, I'm aware of him being a Supreme Court justice all these years, but, a pubic hair on a Coke can. I mean, that was sort of, I was in my early 20s, mid 20s, I think, when I first heard those words, and they stuck with me for a long time. The other sort of, I guess, notion I have of Clarence Thomas, comes from a couple of sort of rather incomplete profiles of him, journalistic publications, The New Yorker, where he's just basically renowned for not asking questions. And the implication has been also he's like checked out and he's not that active, but he's written a tremendous amount of decisions. Just give us some of those numbers so that we can sort of dispel with some of these myths.
Yeah, so he's written over 700 opinions. Not all of them by any stretch were decisions because he was, dissenting. But yeah, he's written over 700 opinions, often in any given year. And I'm sorry if you just mentioned this, my cat was meowing really loudly, so I couldn't hear everything. But often in a year, he writes the most on average of any Supreme Court justice. They're very lengthy opinions. And they, were often and continue to be quite extreme. But what we've seen over the years is that they lay down a marker of a very hard right position that initially very few people will join, if anybody. But with time, people on the court slowly start coming around to it. Just to give a quick example, Thomas, the Heller decision, the gun rights decision, which declared that the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is an individual personal right, which came out in 2008, that was a Justice Scalia decision. But Thomas was the first one in the late 1990s on the modern court to suggest that this is how the Second Amendment ought to be interpreted. And it didn't get much attention at the time, except amongst, insiders. But of course, that provides the roadmap. And I think we can see this on a number of other issues as well. So it's not just the volume of his opinions, it's that they tend to be a kind of the pace setter for what is to come down the road.
And I've after I guess in the wake of reading your book, my sense of him not speaking during the oral arguments, I don't know. I guess I may be imposing this a little bit, but I see that as consistent with his fatalism about race on some level. Like there's a certain, I think you called it, gosh, I can't. Futilitarian. But let's wait to get there because I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is the interesting thing or it starts with and you break down sort of there's three aspects, I guess, to the man or to the not so much the man, but the Thomasian thought, I guess, is built on race, capitalism, and constitution. And you look at his intellectual and legal and I guess his policy or his politics in some ways. Let's start with the intellectual and sort of race. He started out as and has continued in your estimation as a black nationalist that started back at Holy Cross. And I knew a lot of guys who went to and women who went to Holy Cross, having been from Worcester. They were not black nationalists.
So he was the part of a cohort of young black men who were recruited to integrate Holy Cross in 1968. There were 18 of them, and they were quite an illustrious, I should say, cohort of men. They include the novelist, people who would go on to things, the novelist Edward Jones, who won the Pulitzer Prize, Stanley Grayson here in New York, and some other figures. So they were, quite accomplished. He was, one of the poorest of them, came from the Deep South, from Georgia, and they get there, and it's 1968. Martin Luther King has been assassinated, so it's a very tumultuous time for in the nation and for black people and black activists. And they formed themselves into quite a militant group called the Black Student Union. Now, that doesn't sound to us particularly militant, but at the time, the nomenclature was significant. You were really affirming blackness as a political project. And they start making demands on the university that that Holy Cross, accept more black students, that they offer more courses in black literature, bring black artists to the campus, have black music at parties, the whole nine yards. And what it was really about was confronting a situation of massive whiteness. Thomas had grown up in pretty much an all-black environment, even though it was the Jim Crow South. And confronting, being one of the few or sometimes the only black person in a white situation would prove to be a formative experience for him. And he comes out of this. And at the same time, I should say, he's reading Malcolm X. He's listening to records of Malcolm X's speeches because this is how people, guys would hear these things. This is before YouTube and the internet. And he really imbibes a whole sort of ideology. He becomes active in a kind of Black Panthers sort of related circle. And he develops, I guess you might say, two ideas really become formative for him with time. The first is the sense that racism is so deeply woven into the fabric of American society, of white American society, that it can never really be eliminated. It's just too deeply structured into America. And again, he never loses this idea, as we can talk about in a second. And then the second part of this, and again, it reflects the moment. And there's an increasing sort of fatalism about being able to change any of this through political means. And so by the time he ends his sort of time on the left, he's really become incredibly politically pessimistic about the possibilities of transforming America's racial condition. And it gives rise to a kind of belief that, perhaps black people need to go their own way. They need to recognize that their fate and their interests cannot be accommodated by white America, certainly not through any kind of conventional or radical political means. And instead, they need to build up their own institutions, build up their own, economies, build up black manhood. And this is a strain, I should say, of black nationalism. It's not the whole of it by any stretch, but there are certainly elements of this you find in Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey and people like that. So that's the milieu, the late 1960s and early 1970s, even before he makes his turn to the right. It's very, very strongly race conscious. It's a belief in kind of black separatism. And ultimately, it comes to be a belief that there are really no political avenues to ameliorate or redress these problems.
Okay, so I got a bunch of questions about that, and let me just start with Holy Cross. Were all those guys Catholics? I mean, I know that Thomas was, and I wonder how much Catholicism, because you don't touch on it too much in the book.
Yeah.
I wonder how much Catholicism informed that, because I don't know what percentage of my graduating high school from Doherty High went to Holy Cross, but it was significant. And I spent some time on that campus, and there was, and this was 20 years later, but there was a specific flavor, I would say, to Holy Cross.
Yeah, I mean, I grappled with the question of Thomas's Catholicism, and one thing I didn't even talk about in the book is his first year of college, he actually was studying to be a priest at a seminary in Missouri, which he left after his first year, again in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, where he felt the seminary in Missouri was just incredibly racist. And this led to a big rift between him and his grandfather that wasn't really resolved until much later in life, if at all. And his grandfather was very important to him. So Catholicism, certainly, and he went to Catholic schools in high school as well. So it was very important to his formation. I didn't focus on it so much because I think, there are other influences and currents that explain more of how he got to where he got. But it's certainly a part of the story.
Okay, and I suspect that comes out in some of his sort of like patriarchal ideas, but we can talk about that when we get to that. But the black nationalism, when he has those ideas, like, was there a difference? Because I think you make the point that a part of this story is the idea of like, what do you do with that black nationalism if you've decided that that project has failed in some way?
Right. Yeah.
So talk about like what the perspective was going into that moment where there was a perception that it failed, and then what it looks like on the other side.
Sure. So, in the 19th, the real high water mark of participation and active militancy is really, in the first half of the 1960s. And by 1968, even though you've had the rise of people like Malcolm X and Black Power, it's a slow rise, and it's oftentimes in response to frustration of the impatience, really, that the failure of the kind of mainstream civil rights movement to transform things quickly enough. And so you have this bubbling up during the 1960s, and by 1968 is really the last big legislative achievement for the civil rights movement, which is the Fair Housing Act. And then you have the election of Richard Nixon, which, imagine the election of Trump, but with far, far more racial violence on both sides, far more, and a war that's really, not only is it a catastrophic war, but its presence is felt throughout the entirety of the society. So this is a really pretty bleak moment, I think, for many people, and particularly for people in the Black freedom struggle. And it's at that moment that, Thomas is really coming to political consciousness and taking this kind of very militant Black nationalist turn. And let's just add into that equation that throughout American history, going back to the sort of first Black nationalist, kind of text, the 1850s, Martin Delany, Black nationalism oftentimes gets traction and gets going precisely at these moments of political bleakness, because there's a philosophy there, just about the kind of irreducible separateness and apartness of the Black nation, of the Black people, that unlike other peoples in the United States, their interests and their aspirations just cannot be accommodated. And so this is what propels this kind of separatist, build up the race kind of philosophy. So that's, all in the mix for Thomas. And then, things just start getting worse. And he graduates in 1971. It's the year of Kent State. One of the last things he does as a militant, he goes to this massive protest in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was extraordinarily violent. There was, I think it was the largest, protest in the history of Cambridge or something like that. And the police presence was very heavy. And I just think, the overpowering sense of the futility of all of this kind of stuff just starts sinking in to him. And you marry that sense of futility. I mean, what Black nationalism had going for it was, amidst this political desolation, we can offer a path forward. But if now the path forward, of kind of more militant Black nationalism seems closed, you can see, the trajectory that's starting to develop there. And I'll just add up one other thing, without going on too long. Many Black nationalists at this moment in the early 1970s really take a turn away from politics. At the local level in particular, they start really looking to the economy as the pathway of advance. And sometimes this can mean building up just Black business. Sometimes it can mean pushing for hiring of Black workers. Sometimes it can mean creating a parallel Black economy. But it's a very strong economistic turn that often involves a kind of renewed engagement with capitalism and the marketplace, and an appreciation that this might offer us other paths. So again, this is all going on in Black nationalist circles before Thomas has even begun his move to the right. And so part of the argument of the book is you can see the seeds are being planted there for someone to take a kind of right turn from these earlier leftist doctrines.
Yeah, I had a professor in college who started out as a guy who was working in the Peace Corps and prevented a military service from using an island. I think I can't remember where it was. Maybe it was a Polynesian island as a test ground for nuke weapons. And he ended up like a Reagan conservative. And I think part of that was just sort of like he realized he took a tremendous beating after that and had nowhere to go. And I think he realized, like, if you're, and the type of advice he would give me, knowing that I was of the left, was like, don't go to some law school that's all namby-pamby. Learn, the skills and defeat them at that, within the rules of the game as they're set, because your radicalism is futile, and you will not be able to change anything enough, and you can actually do better by staying within the system and being, and I thought that was sort of a fascinating turn, and it feels like that's what happened with Thomas on some level. And there were, with Thomas, as with most of people, there's a combination of factors. There was also he goes to law school. He starts getting debt that he has to pay back. He has a wife and a son. This is from his first marriage. There are all kinds of things that would say maybe militancy is not the path to take. But again, I don't, some people say, aha, you see, this was all pure strategic opportunism. The fact of the matter is that there was an easy path for him to do if that's all that he cared about. He temporarily, for a couple of years, had a job with Monsanto in Missouri, and that was a lucrative corporate gig. And he could have just stayed on that path and done that. But that, he remains a political person in the sense that he, has a project. I think, the constellation of ideas that he had developed on the left then hitting up against the wall of this defeat with the right-wing backlash and the sort of stalling of the black freedom struggle, I think leads him to think there's got to be a better path, one that is not through the political sphere, but perhaps through kind of more economic modes of development. And that really does set him up for his turn to the right. And I have to say that I think my perception of Thomas was a guy who sort of ignored racism, but it sounds like it's just the opposite on some level. He perceives it as being immutable in the context of the United States. Talk about that sort of racial pessimism, which is, and where it's shared on the left.
Yeah. So it's all, not only do you see, what was so interesting to me in doing the research for this book was that previous biographers had noted that Thomas had this past at Holy Cross and in the early 70s at Yale Law School, and then thought it was over and that was it. What was so striking to me was how persistent this belief in the immutability of racism, the intractability of racism is, and that it's all over his jurisprudence. And it comes up in all kinds of corners and circumstances where you would not expect it. But the beliefs are that, there's a couple. One is, I think it's an essentially psychological theory of racism. It's not particularly political or economic, and by that I mean he thinks that, white people are racist. He says, how it began, we don't know. How it will ever end, probably we certainly don't know and probably can't see. It almost has no roots at all, and I think he thinks it's part of a kind of an assumption of superiority that white people just have. And so then it gets expressed in two forms, racism. So that's where it comes from. It's a kind of psychological motivation, attitudes. And it gets expressed either in the stigma that gets put onto black people, where they are assumed to be inferior. And there's all kinds of ways in which Thomas traces this out. Or it comes out in the form of unconscious biases, when white people think of themselves as anti-racist or non-racist, but nevertheless their language, their claims, their beliefs, their statements always betrays the unconscious racism that's there. And what's amazing is that, both of those ideas, stigma and unconscious bias, are pretty much the cornerstones of the contemporary social psychology of race in academia. So Thomas is, what makes him a kind of peculiar figure and difficult to get your head around is he really accepts, I think, some basic left-wing or liberal, I should say, or liberal and left-wing, it depends, ideas about racism, how deeply rooted it is, that it has this kind of very deep psychic source, all the rest of it, but does not think the standard left-wing or liberal ideas follow from that. And so what you're left with is a very deep racial pessimism that is kind of the structuring core. I mean, as you said, the book begins with race and then goes to capitalism and then goes to Constitution. Race is the bedrock of his worldview. And in that sense that it doesn't really have a politics, that it's that it's so deeply rooted in individuals and that we find it in individuals. I do think it reflects kind of larger currents of how we deal with the left. How we deal with race on the left. Very much focused on people's individual biases. We use the phrase structural racism, which used to mean something like when I was in graduate school, it meant something very different. I think what people mean by it now is, white people are racist. All white people are racists. That's very much similar. That's Thomas's. That's the bedrock of Thomas's belief.
But isn't because you say that it's for him, racism is all psychological, and it feels to me that even but you would know better, and maybe I'm just I'm looking at it, my race-colored glasses, I guess, or maybe not looking at this. From a distance. But I do think that people do have a different sense of what structural racism is. I mean, I tend to think that there is an understanding of structural racism, and also even in the liberal left, and certainly in the sort of left of liberal, there is an understanding that on some level, class and a political economy, contributes to this. Does he have? Is his notion of race completely divorced from that in terms of its origins?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he doesn't really have an account of origins. I'm sure if you were to press him, he'd see he was caught up in the history of slavery. But like many people, I think he would probably think that racism preceded slavery and inspired slavery as opposed to emerging out of slavery. So he doesn't have a very materialistic understanding at all. There is no political economy. It's very much a social psychological theory of race. And I do think that is pretty common amongst a lot of liberals. I mean, I was really, just as sort of a side note, but I was struck this past weekend, there was a bit of a fight between Elizabeth Warren and her critics, her kind of more mainstream Democratic critics, because she had compared the struggle for Medicare for all to the struggle for women's suffrage and the civil rights movement and even the abolition of slavery. And I think it was Carol Moseley Braun said, abolition of slavery, that didn't involve raising taxes. It was about getting rid of privilege. And I thought, actually, the abolition of slavery from a material point of view was was far more consequential than a simple raising of taxes. It was a huge dispossession of property. And there was this notion of privilege as if it were somehow apart from material life. And I think that's very common, actually, on the left and amongst liberals, is to see, to look for racism in kind of the speech acts of people, to look for it in the way people treat other people, but not to pay enough attention to, things like healthcare differentials or wealth differentials and things like that. So I don't see it as a race versus class issue. It's more like, do you see the materiality of racism? And again, when I say all this, Thomas is very in sync with all of that. He doesn't really dwell too much on the materiality of racism. It's all the kind of the biases and the speech acts and the way people are treated that really matter.
All right. So, and so much it seems of his perception of both capitalism and the Constitution are, it seems to me, a function of that there is an essential quality to racism that can never go away, because it's almost to the extent that it's structural, it is almost like structural in the way that it's neurological. And that it is a permanent feature of people who are Caucasian, and others, and it's always going to be with us. And so how do we, and so his project, as you call it, is still informed by that reality, or his reality that racism is a permanent fixture in this country. So then it becomes basically anytime the government attempts to deal with race, it's worse for black people.
Yes.
All right. So, because now we're getting into the sort of the realm where people may recognize a little bit like black people are in some way like the hammock has turned into a, like a, what is it? The safety net has become like a sticky hammock in some way or something.
Right. So, the argument of the book is not simply that just, Clarence Thomas is a black nationalist. It's also that he's a conservative black nationalist. And I think this is, as you say, where some of this starts seeming a little bit more intelligible. But I think before we get to things like the welfare state, I think we got to begin, first of all, with his hostility to politics in general. This goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s. He gave an amazing interview to Juan Williams in The Atlantic, and where he talks about the idea of black people mobilizing through the vote. And he says, let's say we got organized and acted, had some kind of group power in the electoral sphere, something like gerrymandering or something like that. What's going to happen? We are the group on the bottom, and every single time we will lose, we will get the hell beaten out of us. And the only people who are going to be worse off than we would be, he says, maybe American Indians. And so, at the heart of this is this belief that black people's political involvement is at best a fool's errand, and at worst will only make them further dependent upon the benevolence and good wishes of white people. So, if you read his voting rights jurisprudence, something that is sort of Exhibit A for most people, that this is the worst part of Thomas. When you read it carefully, what he's really saying is, yes, it's very clear that black people have a common interest. That he doesn't doubt. And yes, it's very clear that they're at the bottom. That he doesn't doubt. But it's when you start translating that into the political realm through kind of, some kind of method of empowering black voters to elect black officials, let's say, he sees all manner of mischief following from it. And the bottom line is he just would prefer black people stay out of that world. And then he looks at a whole bunch of state policies. And what's, again, fascinating is whether it's on disparate impact, which is a whole realm of doctrinal law in the Constitution, or the Takings Clause, which is another big part of the Constitution, or the Commerce Clause. The overwhelming argument and pervasive theme is all these efforts to redress and improve the condition of black people by the state only ends up harming black people. And I think, affirmative action for him is really, Exhibit A of this. And what's so fascinating about his affirmative action opinions is he doesn't, like most white conservatives, take the principle of colorblindness and say affirmative action is wrong because you're treating black people differently from white people, and that's unfair to the white person. What he says instead is that affirmative action is a way not of creating a stigma against black people, but perpetuating a pre-existing stigma of black people. That the only way you can get ahead is through the assistance and benevolence of white people. And it doesn't matter if you got ahead without affirmative action or not. Everybody who's black is stained by affirmative action, and their achievements are called into question, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, it empowers white people, because he sees the administrators of affirmative action programs at universities and the decision makers as white. It empowers them to make discretionary judgments about which black people they will associate with and choose to include in their sort of ruling class circles. So he thinks it enhances white discretionary power and increases black dependence upon that power. So this is just a whole range of arguments that he's mounting to say, when the state involves itself in trying to help black people, it makes things worse. So on the one hand, you have that, and then on the other hand, we have his vision of capitalism, which, again, he's not that he says...
Let's just hold there, because I want to just ask you some questions about that notion of race. And when you say that he he doesn't accept the typical conservative view of like you're discriminating against white people. Because at one point, I think you write, and I can't remember the ruling off the top of my head. Maybe it's in the context of the University of Michigan Law School case that, like, look, white people, you don't want to get into a tit for tat as to who's been victimized by race more because you're going to lose, essentially. But so his argument is, and we should also say that, like, he benefited from affirmative action, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And so he has. I mean, I guess it's impossible to, and maybe you have a sense of this. Like, to what extent did he feel that impacted him in that way?
Huge. I mean, huge. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and address that, and also this notion of, it also seems to me that in all of those calculations he's making about voting, about admissions to colleges, that even if whites maintain, even if I accept the premise that all white people are going to be just as racist as they are, 200 years ago, today and tomorrow, I mean, just sheer population numbers, right, would have some impact on my perception as to whether this is going to be relevant in the future.
So let's maybe I was going to take the second first, but
take the affirmative action one first, and then I'll remind you of the numbers.
Okay. Thomas gets into Yale Law School on an affirmative. It's kind of a strict quota program, although far more strict than a previous quota that had been used. And that's, Yale Law School is this sort of transformative moment for him, because he feels like up until that point he had been told repeatedly that you got this far despite being black. And the thing that he at least valued that was that he could say, you see, these achievements that I have under my belt, I didn't get them from the help of white people. I got them through, my own personal grit and talent, but also through the help of black people. And so they were achievement. And this is important to note, like, Thomas is not a rugged individualist. He's not an impersonal meritocrat or anything like that. He really does believe that his achievements were due to the kind of mutual provision, collective provision of the black community, and particularly of his grandfather and the black family. But then he says you get to Yale Law School, and now the line is, before, if you got ahead despite your race, now you're getting ahead because of your race. And the people who are telling him this, he says, are white liberals. The very people who would like to distinguish themselves from the kind of vicious, overt racist in the South. These are well-meaning, well-intentioned white people, but who can never stop reminding you that that you're here on the basis of our benevolence. He really bridles at that. So on the one hand, he will say, I definitely, got ahead in part because of affirmative action. He even admits at one point, as I recall, that, George H.W. Bush, appointed him in part because he was black, something that Bush completely denied, but was obviously true. And yet, for him, the problem with it is that it prevents black people from claiming this achievement is theirs. And so he feels like it's a major assault on dignity, that it reinforces this stigma, and it always ensures that black people, carry this around with them. So, despite admitting it, I think he has an argument about why he thinks it's harmful. And again, what's important is that it doesn't harm white people; it harms black people. And this, I think, gets to your second question. Won't white people's views? I think Thomas would say no, and in his own experience, would be Exhibit A that he trot out for that. That it didn't change. The fact that he was there around all these white people hasn't changed their perception of the black community. And again, I think the other point, and this gets back to the separatism. I mean, he has said in some of his opinions, black students will do better when they're by themselves, apart from white people. They will learn more. They will take more pride in their achievements. They will get further. So he's, sort of supported HBCUs in one opinion, and has really called into question whether or not integrating and diversifying institutions does much to benefit black people. He thinks white people are benefited from it, not because they become more knowledgeable about black people, but because they get to style themselves as sophisticated and cosmopolitan. And, look, here's me with all my diverse friends. And he uses the word racial aesthetic over and over and over again. And he thinks white people have a racial aesthetic that calls for black faces at the table. But it's not really about establishing any kind of knowledge or interaction in any real sense.
So now, and I guess what I was saying about the numbers was not that the presence of black people amongst white people in any type of numbers is going to change the perspective of white people. I'm just stipulating his notion that it's immutable, this perspective. But I'm just saying sheer numbers. Like at one point, the trajectory of our population is going to be, at the very least, that white people are not going to be the dominant in terms of numbers. I mean,
I see what you mean. I think that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I have to say, the fact, I think that there is certainly some merit to the perspective of affirmative action it can be used against you as a black person. I mean, I raise it in the context of this this conversation. Right. I mean, that's in part some evidence towards his assertion. I don't think it has the same implications, and I want to talk about sort of the psychology involved in all of this,
right?
Relative to it informing Supreme Court decisions from a guy who's sort of supposedly a strict constructionist. But right. but just what about that notion of
sheer numbers?
In sheer numbers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know if he ever really considers it explicitly. I think if I were to guess an answer, and this is me speculating, I think he would say, remember, he's a black nationalist. That's where he comes from, and politically, intellectually, and stuff. And I think there's a specificity to the African-American experience to him. And so the fact that schools will be more diverse, maybe with South Asian people, maybe with Latinos, Asian Americans, I think for him, the real question, it really comes down to black people. And black people are going to remain a minority, just numerically. And this is, what he has come back to so the combination of the kind of low social status and the history of racism and all the rest of it, plus just the numerical fact of being, 11% of the population, I think he sees African Americans as kind of an exceptional minority. If, in standard parlance, Asian Americans are the model minority, or Jewish Americans, he sees African Americans as the most degraded minority, and very separate, and their experience is very apart. This isn't a general affirmation of people of color kind of argument. This is specific to the black community.
Fair enough. So let's.
That was speculation on my
right.
part,
No, I understand. I think that's possible. Although it's sort of hard to reconcile from his he's married to a white woman, and he's these are weird sort of contradictions. It feels like, at least. I mean, who knows? But all right, so let's talk about how he squares all of these sort of psychological assessments of white people and of society and whatnot with the Constitution, because you conceive of it as he sees a white Constitution and a black Constitution. Yeah.
So you brought up before this question of him supposedly being a strict constructionist, somebody who's faithful to the Constitution. And in the contemporary world, the word that gets bandied about is an originalist. And I'm just sort of giving some background to the question you're asking here. And originalists are supposed to be people who faithfully interpret the Constitution in accordance with the words as they were originally understood or intended. There's some argument about that. And people often cite Thomas, both his defenders and his critics, as an originalist. And the truth is he's not really an originalist at all. He's very opportunistic in his originalism. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't, and it's very hard to square, as you suggested, a lot of his positions with an originalist position. However, one of the issues that comes up in a lot of these debates is, when you say originalism, do you mean the Constitution as it was adopted in 1787 and then ratified in 1789, the original Constitution, or do you mean the Constitution that was transformed by the Civil War and Reconstruction through the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? And the charge against most originalists, conservative originalists, is that they ignore that second Constitution from Reconstruction and the Civil War. Thomas does not ignore that second Constitution. He takes it very seriously, in certain ways far more seriously than most people on either side, of the left or the right. But he has a very particular interpretation of it. In his mind, that second Constitution was transformed by and in the interests of black people, the people who were enslaved. And he thinks out of that experience came a new appreciation of the freedom of black people, but that that freedom is very much located in one fundamental right, which is the right to bear arms. Now, there's a long tradition on the black left and in black nationalism of championing the right to bear arms for black people. And Thomas oftentimes channels that tradition, particularly in his opinions. McDonald versus Chicago, which was in 2010, was a classic of this. And he rereads the whole history of the Second Amendment, not as the story of white colonial militias mustering against the British, not as the story of white homeowners in the suburbs protecting themselves from black criminals, all the stereotypes we think of, but instead as the story of black people terrorized by white people, first by the slaveholders and then by white supremacists, and wanting to arm themselves and desperately needing to. And that this is a right that's fundamental not just to the black community, but also to black masculinity.
All right. So let me just back up. So to give people who may not sort of be terribly familiar with Reconstruction to just sort of like place this. And we should also say that his contemporaries while I don't know if it was exactly when he was at Holy Cross, but certainly around that time, were in California basically causing Ronald Reagan to start gun control because they were showing up at city council meetings with shotguns.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Black Panther Party platform is, one of, I can't remember, is about black arms and the right to bear arms and so forth. So it's, it's very central.
And we should say, though, that, I mean, this is the thing I can't quite get my head around, or I guess maybe I can in some way. Like when we talk about, and I don't know that we've really introduced this concept too much on this show, but about that second Constitution with the addition of the 13th and 14th Amendment, everything that's happening in Reconstruction and the ambitions that lie there, and then basically the beginning of the end of Reconstruction, which was a function of the Colfax massacre, where basically, we don't know exactly how many, but like, I don't know, 150, 200 black people were killed by essentially the KKK as they do pushback on the ascendance of black power in Reconstruction. And I guess the argument in his mind is, had they availed themselves of the Second Amendment, this would have the gains in Reconstruction would have been maintained. Is that it? Because you also he looks back on Jim Crow as an era where it is, sort of some type of model for okay, but take it from there. I just wanted to provide that background.
So, and the importance of the Colfax massacre is that it produces this Supreme Court decision that's about the Second Amendment, Cruikshank, United States versus Cruikshank, United States versus Cruikshank, or Cruikshank versus the United States, and the question is whether or not the Second Amendment applies to the states, and this is from the 1870s, and the court says no, it doesn't. It's a federal right, and this is viewed oftentimes as the kind of one of the beginnings, or one of many setbacks for Reconstruction. So Thomas is not being all that peculiar there in arguing that the right to arm black people and for black people to protect themselves was considered one of the critical rights, and that for black freedom, and that when it was taken away, it helped sow the seeds of this major backlash. I don't think Thomas would go, and here we come to the second part of your question. I don't think he would go so far as to say, Reconstruction could have lasted, because it doesn't fit with his pessimism. I think and this gets into this question of black masculinity and black dignity. I think he sees black people being able to defend themselves, not as a vehicle to some kind of transformation towards a multiracial society, but towards a condition for their survival and their dignity apart from white people. It's a way to protect themselves from white marauders and to develop their own institutions apart from white people. And again, it's very focused on black men. He closes his decision in MacDonald with the memory of an older black man, thinking back when he was a young boy, and seeing his father stand in the doorway holding off a white mob with a gun. And Thomas says something like it was an image of salvation or something like that. And that's a very resonant element in the black tradition, this idea of black men arming themselves, not to transform the society. And again, so it's not that Reconstruction could have lasted, but more that they could have at least protected themselves and shepherded themselves to some kind of life apart from white people. And then I think we get into what Jim Crow was for him. That for all the degradations of Jim Crow, the fact that black people could not look to the state for aid and provision meant that they were forced back on themselves. And here his grandfather is a really important model for him. His grandfather raised him. He was a black small business owner in Savannah, and amassed wealth and property. And Thomas says, I owe almost everything to him and that example. And he was very stern and kind of an Old Testament patriarch kind of a figure, and very authoritative. And he said these were the kinds of men who, in the face of the worst degradation from white society and the white state, helped build up the black race, helped build the black people with resources that were internal to them, where they were not dependent and on white people. And that for him is why Jim Crow is kind of in a golden age. And it's an extraordinarily romantic fantasy. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about this. I don't say it in the book because I prefer to let the text, the words speak for themselves. But it's this is that vision.
It also is. I mean, it's one where I think even casual observers of the right today would see that. Like it reminds me immediately of Paul Ryan's apocryphal story about the black kid who comes to school and would much rather have a brown bag lunch than a lunch provided by the public school because it gives them the dignity and this and that. And it's, it turned out to be like a compilation of a couple of stories that were all fabricated, but nevertheless, that's the same sort of mythology, right? Like this idea of when you're completely stripped of any societal support, that's when you become your real you, if you're a guy.
Yes, and this is, I think, people have asked me what's the connection between Thomas and some of the arguments of the reactionary mind, and this was, I said, at the heart of the reactionary mind was this idea that under these conditions of tremendous exigency and adversity and constraint, where there's very little support for you from, and again, for Thomas, this is a particular valence, very little support from you from white people. He doesn't mind getting support from black people, and he, again, we'll talk about his grandfather and the support he got from his grandfather and sometimes his grandmother and other people like that. But when you're sort of thrown back, when the black community is thrown back on itself, these resonant, powerful, patriarchal men will rise to the occasion. And he sees liberalism. He sees the civil rights movement. He sees the Warren Court and the New Deal as assaults on these generations of black men. And that what they did was they crippled their will and discipline, their iron will to and their sense of responsibility to the black community. They just devitalize them by making life too easy. And Thomas wants to make life hard for black people. Not because he loathes black people, and not because he loves black people either, but because he believes that in a racist society like the United States, black people need all the internal power and organization they can get, apart from white people, and that black men are the ones to provide it. And he has said explicitly, the salvation of the black race depends upon black men. But to get those types of black men, these patriarchal figures, you have to create conditions of exigency and constraint so that they can overcome them and develop the internal power and skills. And so it's a very disturbing and unsettling picture by the end of the book, and it's meant to be deliberately unsettling and disturbing because it begins from these premises that I think some people on the left would find recognizable, and then it ends in this horrible dystopia that happens to look very much like the world that we live in today.
And I want to wrap this up, and I appreciate your hanging with me for so long on this today. But it also occurs to me that when you contemplate the centrality of masculinity or malehood to that political project he has, that it puts into context his claim that the Anita Hill appearance at his hearings was a high-tech lynching. Because it wasn't just that this was happening to a black person. It's happening to a black man.
Right.
And
exactly.
And that becomes central to the essence of, it's almost like there is no racism if it's not a guy who's being subjected to it in his mind.
Yeah, and this came up, in fact, during the Anita Hill. The whole, the theory of intersectionality of Kimberly Crenshaw predates it, but it got traction and popularity coming out of that, and influence coming out of that experience, because it was depicted as Thomas represents race, Thomas is black, and Hill represents women. And what people said is, the real question there is who gets to why was it forgotten that Anita Hill was also black? And I think you have hit, the head on the nail here, which is that for Thomas, racism is directed, I think, against the black community, but because he understands the centrality, because he believes in the centrality of black men to the fate of black community, racism really takes its form against black men. And there's very little role in his, I call it a dreamscape. There's very little role for black women in that story, except either as traitors, and that's how he views Anita Hill, or as kind of weak-willed figures of dependency.
So, all right. So lastly, how much do you think his colleagues or the conservative legal movement understand the underpinnings? How relevant is it that they do? Do they just sort of cherry pick what they like that comes out of him? And what are the implications going forward for us with this? And
Sure.
Please answer in 30 seconds.
Okay.
No, I'm joking.
Oh, I was going to try. It's very clear to me most white conservatives either have not a clue what he's really talking about or are very selectively interpreting him. And there's a long history of that with him. Some do, but many don't. But in a way, I don't think it matters. And I think this is where his story becomes part of a larger political story that's relevant to all of us. Because what is so clear in his jurisprudence is how easy it is to fit this very pessimistic view of race with all of these conservative positions. And then when you have the election of someone like Trump, who, by the way, has said that Clarence Thomas is his favorite justice, Trump's white nationalism is also premised upon this view that the world is divided by races or maybe cultures, and that white people have a special destiny apart from darker-skinned people, and our assumption that this country is racially polarized in a way that it has never been before, which I think is not true. I think we have been racially polarized, sometimes worse before. But anyway, you start to see how Thomas is actually not just speaking for himself, and he's not even speaking for the right. He's advocating, but also describing a world that is very much the world we live in. That is to say, massive accumulations of wealth in the hands of a few, mass incarceration, which is something that he supports, predominantly with higher percentages of people, black men in the black community, getting incarcerated, and racial conflict and racial pessimism, as far as the eye can see, and people armed to the teeth. And this is Thomas's world. This is the world that he sees. This is the world that he believes in. So his significance, whether white conservatives know or don't know what's going on in his opinions, really transcends them. I think there's no more resonant representative voice on the Supreme Court who so speaks to the nation as it is currently constituted as Clarence Thomas.
Well, that's a little bit terrifying, but also fascinating, and I appreciate your sharing it with us. Corey Robin, we will put a link to the Enigma of Clarence Thomas on majority.fm. Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.